Howdy, everyone. Russ with the Reg team here to introduce our next speakers. Cisco Talos researchers Nick Biasini and Edmund Brumaghin will be presenting a talk titled The Crimeware Arms Race, Modern Techniques in Malware Armoring and Evasion. At the end of the talk, you can join a live Q&A with our presenters. Simply click the link that will be displayed at the end of the talk and you'll be taken to the live Q&A channel. Nick and Edmund, over to you.
Okay, thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk to you a bit about the Crimeware arms race. Who am I? My name is Nick Biasini. I'm a threat researcher with Cisco Talos. I actually got my start as a SOC analyst working in a 24/7 government SOC. Over the years, I've been an analyst, lead analyst, managed teams of analysts. I've basically done everything except for write code, which is a great thing because no one should ever use my code anywhere other than on my laptop. But what I do now is I basically hunt threats and do research all day. My notable research has been around exploit kits in the past. I did a lot of stuff around domain shattering and Angular exploit kit. Now I spend most of my time hunting crimeware.
Awesome. My name is Edmund Brumaghin. I'm also a security researcher with Cisco Talos. So I love malware. That's what we do day in, day out. We're neck deep in malware constantly. Prior to joining Talos, I spent the better part of the previous decade doing digital forensics and incident response in a variety of different roles within security operations teams. I've held pretty much every role you can have on a security operations team prior to coming over and joining Talos. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover malware armoring and evasion. So we're going to talk a little bit about malware armoring, what it is, what it looks like, what it's designed to achieve for adversaries that bake it into their malware. We're also going to talk about evasion, some of the differences between armoring and evasion, some of the techniques that we're seeing adversaries leverage across the threat landscape. And then we're going to follow it up with a pretty in-depth case study on a specific piece of malware that Nick and I were involved in researching that kind of provides a textbook example of the types of techniques that we're seeing adversaries implement within their malware to try to evade detection, evade analysis environments, render analysis more difficult, and things of that nature. And then at the end, we'll talk about ways that you can detect and defend against these sort of mechanisms within malware. So let's start out with an introduction to armoring and evasion as concepts. So malware armoring is designed to prevent analysis of an executable, and this is commonly implemented within various malware that you see across the threat landscape, but it doesn't necessarily have to be malware, but that's where you see it most common. It's designed to make analysis more difficult, to make it take as long as possible and to be as difficult as possible for someone actually performing the analysis of the sample, and this takes a lot of different forms. You'll see code obfuscation. You'll see obfuscation of the Windows APIs that malware will typically use to gain different functionality that the malware may be trying to perform, such as initiating network connections and some of the environmental things that you see malware implement. It also attempts to prevent proper disassembly. So you'll see different techniques used within the code itself to try to make disassemblers not accurately disassemble the code into an analyzable form. You'll see the implementation of things like junk code, tons of useless instructions that when you're an analyst and you're trying to walk through code execution flow makes that process much more difficult and makes it harder to follow. You'll also see this for dynamic analysis, to prevent dynamic analysis in the form of things like debugger detection. So the main idea here is that armoring is designed to stop the researchers that are doing the code execution flow analysis, that are analyzing the actual disassemble payload. Now contrast that with evasion, which sometimes can look similar, but is designed to evade analysis environments. So when you think about malware analysis, right, a lot of researchers will run instrumented environments as things like sandboxes, and they'll attempt to detonate malware samples in those environments to determine what those samples are designed to do. And so evasion techniques are typically used to prevent the execution of malware within these environments by detecting that the malware is being executed in a virtual machine, for instance, or performing environmental detection to determine the environment that the malware is operational in so that it can make a decision as to whether or not it should exhibit any of the malicious behavior it's been designed to do. You'll see a lot of anti-sandbox types of techniques implemented in malware to avoid being executed in environments that are known to be instrumented to enable easy analysis of the sample. So evasion is designed to stop that execution from occurring. So the main takeaway here when you're talking about armoring versus evasion is they may look similar, and there are many techniques that are designed for armoring and evasion, but the idea or the thing that the malware author is attempting to achieve is different in those cases. Armoring is designed to prevent analysis of the code present within the malware, whereas evasion is designed to avoid execution in environments that the malware is not interested in, whether that's a sandbox or whether that's systems located in different geographic regions. And so I'll pass it over to Nick to talk about armoring a little bit more in detail.
Thanks, Edmund. So let's dig a little deeper on armoring techniques. So armoring, as Edmund said, is designed primarily to impede the researcher, right? Prevent the code analysis. So the common things you'll see are code obfuscation. And that can even go as far as code encryption. And that primarily is done through things called cryptors. And I'll get more into that in a second. Additionally, you'll see a lot of stuff like packers and various ways to do malware loading. Just a quick caveat here. So there's malware loading, which is how malware is loaded onto an end system, and there are loaders, which is malware that loads additional malware. I'm talking about how malware is loaded onto end systems when I say loaders in this particular context. And then again, lots of examples of junk code, whether that's in the actual code, messing with the assembly or trying to make the disassembly not operate properly. All of those types of things are ways that armoring can occur. So where I'm going to start today is with malware loaders and go a little more detailed into that. I mentioned before that malware loaders is the way in which malware is loaded onto end systems, right? One of the more common ways that we see that is through the use of packers and cryptors. The best way to think of a packer is it's like a self-extracting executable, right? Like a zip compression, effectively. It allows you to take an executable and make it smaller and more compact. Originally, it was created to make it so that it'd be easier to transmit over the network or store on a system. But in today's world, network traffic and data storage is extremely cheap, so it's not really necessary. In today's world, we primarily see it being used by adversaries to make analysis more difficult. And additionally, we usually see these done in combination with cryptors. A cryptor is basically a way to encrypt or obfuscate data. That could be full encryption, simple obfuscation, some sort of XOR key. There's a million different ways that you can obfuscate or make it difficult to analyze. At its core, the way that this operates, though, is when the malicious executable is executed, the decryptor code is executed, which informs the executable how to actually decrypt the encrypted session. This then allows you to have the actual malicious content live only in memory, not on the end system. That'll hinder things like data analysis, make it difficult to detect initially from things like antivirus because it's not operating at disk. You really need to look specifically in memory for the malicious behavior. But that's not the only way that we'll see them do this type of malicious behavior. One of the more common things we'll see is assembler obfuscation. And you can see a couple of examples here. It'll do things like have useless instructions, have obfuscated calls or jumps, make it difficult to understand and walk through the flow. They'll do a bunch of substituted instructions involving a lot of steps in something that could normally take 1 or 2 steps. Again, it's specifically designed to make the analysis by a researcher tedious, very difficult, and harder to follow the actual flow that the malicious executable follows. Now, one of the common things that we'll see as far as detection is concerned is behavior-based detection. You'll see here an example of a DLL injection detection. So you can see on the left, there's a series of behaviors or tasks that they're looking for in order to say, yes, a DLL is currently being injected. So what the adversaries do is they look for ways to break that behavior detection. And one of the ways that they do that is by addressing specifically Windows API calls. In this case, let's look at the virtual Alex type of API call. So one of the common things you'll see is an adversary make an API call. I mean, that's a very easy detection mechanism that's used commonly in AV and various other ways to determine malicious activity is occurring. In this particular instance, they kind of took a unique approach to it. The way that they did it, instead of actually calling the Windows API directly, is they scanned memory looking for that specific API call location, and then they created a hash that identified where that API call resides. So you can see here, instead of saying virtual alloc, the API call to virtual alloc, they then are referencing specifically the hash. Now, to take this even a step further, they're using the call window proc API to actually execute this. So what that does is it provides an even deeper layer of obfuscation. So if you look here on the screen, if you were obfuscated or executing not using call Windows proc, you see the virtual alloc being clearly seen and provides you information about the executable, things like that. But in the area where the actual the call Windows proc is being executed, there's very little data, makes it much, much more difficult to track down. It makes it harder on the researcher. The effect is the same to the end user and to the malicious actor, but the analysis becomes much more tedious and annoying to undertake. Now, another thing that we'll commonly see, it's not uncommon to see malware check for things like names of processes associated with AV, right? That's pretty standard behavior amongst malware authors. But we do see interesting variants of this to just make it annoying and tedious for us. You can see here an example where instead of scanning by the actual process name, they're scanning by a CRC32 checksum of the process name. It's achieving the same goal, but when you're actually trying to analyze the code, it's a different process and a different flow that you have to work through. It's not that same type of process engagement that you're used to. Now, to kind of take it all together, so you have this concept of malware loading, right, where it's being decrypted at some stage. Well, one of the initial things that we've started to see is they've done multi-stage decrypting. And some of that will even include retrieving data from a malware server at runtime. Now, you can imagine how difficult this makes things like static analysis, because if you're looking at the actual file, unless you're able to pull those components down from those malware servers, it's not complete functionality. It may not even appear malicious on the end system. Again, it's all about trying to make it difficult for analysis, trying to kind of hide true functionality. I mean, if you think about it from a modular malware perspective, you could be downloading additional modules as you're actually executing, so you can't necessarily see what is going on or what the true intention of the malware is when you're doing your analysis offline on static analysis, going through your disassemblers, your IDAPROs, your GDRAs, whatever. So as you can see here, this kind of ties together how all of these armament techniques can work. So you have, in this case, a sample of Hawkeye, right? That Hawkeye is being loaded onto the system using a malware loader. Well, what they do is they process hollow and embed and inject that malicious process, in this case, into regasm, that executable. However, the executable itself is never unpacked on disk. It's never decrypted on disk. If you scan the file, it is unlikely that it'll find it. That this will only really be visible when it is actually executed in memory. It makes it far more difficult to do forensic investigations, to detect executables that are not actively running. There's a lot of benefits to this type of armament, and this shows you the lengths to which adversaries will go. But let me go ahead and hand it back over to Edmund to talk a little bit more thoroughly about evasion techniques.
Thanks. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about malware armoring and how that's designed to impede the code analysis that may be performed when researchers are trying to determine what malware is, what it does, the different functionality that's built into it when they're performing that analysis statically or even dynamically in some cases. But there are other techniques that we commonly see implemented within malware that are designed to evade analysis environments altogether. So the whole idea behind this is that the malware author knows that they want to execute malware on a specific set of systems based on, who they're targeting or the types of information they want to gather, and they want to prevent their malware from executing in unintended environments. In a lot of cases, they're specifically looking for analysis environments, so malware analysis labs, antivirus sandboxes, and places that are instrumented that are designed to provide that analysis process and speed it up in a lot of cases. And so that takes a lot of different forms, right? You'll see a lot of emphasis put on detecting whether or not the malware is being executed in a virtual environment versus a physical system. Malware authors recognize that most of the victims that they will be trying to get malware infections on are typically going to be using a physical system, a desktop computer or a laptop or something of that nature. So they try to avoid executing any of the malicious activities in the malware in virtual environments, because most of the time those virtual environments are going to be associated with analysis environments, which is not what they're looking for. To take that a step further, a lot of malware will also look for user interaction with the system before any of the malicious activity occurs. So there will be different checks that are performed, and in a lot of cases there will be things like sleep functions and iterations that'll basically just sit there looking for user interaction, whether that's active Windows state changes that would indicate a user is at a keyboard changing active windows going from program to program. You also see things like sandbox detection, where they'll specifically be looking for artifacts in the operating system that are indicative that it's a sandbox computer, looking at things like the registry, looking at for the presence of specific DLLs, looking for running processes, all of these different artifacts that, if found, would indicate that they're being executed in a virtual environment, so that in most cases the malware will terminate execution or do something different altogether to make the executable appear as if it's benign. So the idea, no malicious activity occurs until all of these checks are performed and the malware is confident it is executing in the environment it's intending to execute in, which is typically end user systems. And like I mentioned, there are often long periods of inactivity associated with this. So the malware will attempt to sleep for extended periods. When you think about sandbox environments, one of the key characteristics is that typically when you push a sample into a sandbox environment and detonate that sample, there's a predefined time period that the sample will be executed. So you'll push it in, it'll be executed in a virtual machine. The virtual machine will run for a specific period of time, in which case a decision will be made, is the executable malicious or benign? And so you'll also see periods of inactivity that attempt to subvert this process by waiting 5, 10, 15, or more minutes before anything malicious occurs to attempt to trick the sandboxes into making a benign determination. Now, in terms of identifying and defeating sandboxes, there are a myriad of different mechanisms that malware can use to perform this. So looking for things like hardware identifiers that would be indicative that the malware is running in a hypervisor, trying to match usernames. So a lot of public sandboxes that are commonly used by analysts and malware researchers are also known to adversaries. And when you execute a malware sample in these environments, they're running under a specific user account within, say, Windows. Threat actors have taken note of the common usernames present for those accounts, and they'll check the username of where the malware is running. And if that username matches a known sandbox username, it won't detonate properly. Looking for things like processes that would be indicative of analysis tools being run that are commonly used while analyzing malware. Looking for debuggers. Checking the file system for the presence of sandbox-related dynamic link libraries that would indicate that the sample is being executed in a sandbox. One other interesting thing is password protection. So requiring positive user interaction to facilitate the execution process gives the malware a pretty good idea that it's not being automatically executed. And then, like I previously mentioned, the use of sleep counters, which can be used to subvert that sandbox execution by not doing anything malicious until after a period of time that would commonly be associated with a sandbox run counter. So I mentioned password protection. This is one of the most common mechanisms we see to try to evade sandboxes. The idea here is you'll see an email similar to the one on the slide where the adversary will send a malicious Office document, for instance, to a potential victim. And in the email, they'll say, hey, here's the password for the Office document. And in order for the Office document to be opened by the victim, they have to input the password for the Office document. Now, if you were to push this into a sandbox that wasn't aware of password protection and didn't provide the mechanism to input that password, nothing malicious would ever occur because the file would just sit there at the password prompt and no macros would be executed and nothing bad would happen. But if you're an actual intended victim and you input that password and enable macros, that's when the malicious activity occurs. So it's a good way that we see to evade sandbox analysis in a lot of cases, and you can kind of see the output there. In this particular case, the macros were designed to execute on auto open, but one of the other things we see a lot of times is rather than executing when the Office document is opened, the macros will be set up to only execute on close, which means that, again, in a lot of sandbox environments, even if you do support password entering into the prompt, the malicious activity won't occur until the Office document is closed. The macros won't kick off the infection process unless the document's closed. So unless your sandbox supports closing the document as well, you'll, again, never see the malicious activity occur. So one of the more interesting techniques that I've seen recently was with GravityRat, which is a malware family that we did some analysis on, where they were actually checking the CPU's thermal temperature to determine if the malware was being executed in a sandbox. So they were using the Windows Management Instrumentation Framework to check what the current temperature of the CPU is. So if you execute this WMI command on a physical system, it spits back a reporting of the current thermal temperature of the CPU. But if you're executing this in a hypervisor environment, like let's say VMware or VirtualBox, it will error because that sort of information isn't available in a virtual machine. So it's a pretty interesting way to identify whether or not the malware is being executed on a physical system or within a virtual environment that may indicate that it's being analyzed in a sandbox. So another pretty common technique we see is the checking for the number of CPU cores that are present in the environment that the malware is being executed in. So in a lot of environments, the idea when you're creating virtual machines is to only give them the amount of available system resources that are required so that you can save resources and run multiple virtual machines. A byproduct of this is that in a lot of cases, the resources that are given to virtual machines that are used in a lot of malware analysis environments don't match what you would typically see on a physical system nowadays. When you think about any cheap laptop that you buy from a major retailer, nowadays you've got at least 2 cores, and in most cases you've got 4 cores or more. But in a lot of VMs, people still configure them with single CPUs. So a lot of malware recognizes this, and they'll check for the existence of multiple CPU cores. And if they don't see 2 or more CPU cores, or if they only see 1 CPU core, they'll assume they're being analyzed and they'll terminate the malicious execution process. Some other common techniques that we see is checking running processes on the system. So there are a lot of utilities that are pretty common during malware analysis, different tools that have been developed that make the analysis more efficient, more effective. And just like the malware researchers, are familiar with those tools, so are adversaries. So a lot of malware will attempt to enumerate the running processes on the system, and they'll check for the presence of different processes running that may be indicative of analysis tools present on the system. And then if they detect those, the malware will terminate. Another common technique is checking the system uptime. So trying to determine how long since the last time the system was booted up. A lot of malware will check and they'll make a determination if the system's been up for less than 15 minutes, the malware will assume it's being analyzed and it will terminate execution. In a lot of sandbox configurations, you create the sandbox VM, you snapshot it, and then you revert to snapshot every time you try to detonate a new malware sample. But if you didn't let your VM run for a couple hours before you took that initial snapshot, it will look like the system just booted up, and malware knows about this. And in a lot of cases, it'll do those system uptime checks to make sure that the system has been running for an extended period, which makes it more likely that it's actually being executed on a victim computer rather than a sandbox environment. One of the other common artifacts we'll see malware check for is recent document metadata. So if you think about on a Windows system, you're constantly opening up different documents. But if you think about certain sandbox environments or virtual machines, those files may not be present. So if you're creating a malware analysis environment, it's important that you put common document files within the common locations within Windows, because malware will check for that. They'll check for recent document artifacts. They'll also check certain directories within Windows where documents are typically stored, and if they don't see any indication of normal long-term user activity, the malware will once again assume it's being detonated in an analysis environment and terminate prior to showing any of the malicious activity the malware is actually designed to do. So the good news is that there are a lot of anti-VM detection tools that have been developed that if you're creating a malware analysis environment, if you're standing up or creating your own sandbox, if you're installing Cuckoo, or if you're just setting up VMs for your own personal malware analysis environment, you should really check out these utilities because they typically provide a way to run an executable or script within the VM before you are ready to put it into your analysis lab, and they will let you know what they find. So they simulate a lot of the same detection techniques that are present within malware, and they'll let you know if you're sufficiently hardened against those sorts of techniques. So Alcazar is one example. Paranoid Fish is another example where when you're initially standing up your VMs, you can get these utilities, run them in your VM, and then look at the report to see if you need to harden your hypervisor. If there's artifacts that are present in your system that are easily detectable by malware, and this will make your sandbox way more effective when you're trying to analyze malware that you may come across in the wild. VBox Hardened Loader is another good example of a situation where you can harden the hypervisor from within the host system itself so that when you create VMs, a lot of the registry-based metadata, the hardware profile of the VM isn't indicative that it's present within VirtualBox. It looks more like a legitimate physical system. And so with that, I'll pass it back over to Nick to talk about some of what we see from a network communications perspective.
Thanks, Edmund. So to this point, we've kind of focused primarily on the actual evasion and armoring of the executable or of the code itself. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how adversaries kind of hide from a network perspective. So this is something that we see commonly. There are a couple of major categories that they fall into. One of the biggest ones is Tor backend. So it's either Tor or I2P.RE or one of these other anonymous network services that allows adversaries to kind of hide their true malicious content in an environment that's a little more challenging to identify. One of the other things that we commonly see is geofencing. This is just saying I'm only going to execute if you are in a place that I want you to be when execution occurs. We see this from time to time. It is occasionally used by commodity malware authors as well as a way to kind of restrict where their malware is being detonated. And then we see a bunch of different behaviors and ways around proxy connections. There has been a long time where people have used compromised systems, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the newer techniques that we've seen. As far as threats that we've covered that display this type of behavior, one of there's a lot of rat behavior actually, Go and LoaderRat, and some of the stuff that Edmund mentioned with GravityRat as well, not just on the network side, but on the evasion side, we commonly see rats implementing a lot of these techniques. Additionally, we've seen Jasper Loader do some interesting stuff around geofencing, and then exploit kits and malvertising are always great examples for ways that adversaries are going to kind of obfuscate their intentions using network techniques, just because the behavior is so dependent on network behavior. So let's start by talking about Tor backends and Tor to web. So basically what adversaries are doing, and we've seen this in exploit kits as I was doing my research, is they have made it so that the initial system that's connected to the internet has very little functionality. It's basically configured as a pass-through. The way that they do that is varied. There's lots of different ways. You can use stuff like Tor to web. This is actually surprisingly simple. I configured this in like 20 minutes. You basically can stand up a server, install Tor to web, and tell it where to point to. And from the clear web, you can access whatever content on the dark web you want. Now, the reason this is appealing to adversaries is now instead of having to host malware on systems that, say, law enforcement can easily seize and take down, all you're doing is seizing and taking down a server that points to another server that's sitting on the dark web. On the dark web is where all of the malicious content resides, all the malware executables, that kind of stuff. It really makes your tracking down on the back end much more difficult. And we see this not just for malicious behavior, but for command and control behavior, just trying to get as much of the malicious activity off of the clear web and moving it to the dark web, just to make analysis and even like law enforcement action that much more difficult. Now, I mentioned geofencing a couple of times. The basic concept here is I will only provide you the malicious content if you are where I want you to be. And the easiest example of that more recently is Jasper Loader. Jasper Loader specifically targets Italy. They use something called PEC emails. In Italy, there is a standardized process for sending people invoices, and that includes using this service called PEC. So they leverage that to send people malicious links. What's interesting is if you're in Italy and you click the link, as you can see on the right here, it's a get for documento.zip, right? Well, if you're in Italy, you get the malware. It's not hard. However, if you are outside of Italy, you then get directed to cnnic.cn, which is the China NIC organization. Now, from a execution perspective, since they're using PEC emails, which is only used in Italy, your victimology is going to be primarily Italian. The reason that you do this is specifically to avoid things like sandboxes or researchers from all around the world that are attempting to do this. In order to analyze this malware truly, you have to have a system that appears as though it's residing in Italy, which again is not a huge ask, but it increases the difficulty, increases the effort required to do the actual analysis. And things like sandboxes may not even support the type of functionality to allow you to look like you're coming from another country. So I've mentioned proxy connections, and there are lots of examples of this, but what we see more and more of is this use of Portmap or ngrok. The concept here is it allows you to access systems from anywhere. So from a malicious perspective, you have a victim PC and you have a C2 server. So basically what happens is your C2 server will establish an OpenVPN connection to, in this case, portmap.io, but it could be ngrok or any of the other services associated with this. When this OpenVPN connection is established, portmap.io basically assigns a domain to that connection that allows you to access that OpenVPN connection from anywhere using that domain. So what the bad guys do is they then embed that domain in their malware. So when a victim gets compromised, they are connecting to a portmap.io domain, which then forwards that connection all the way through to the C2 server. The C2 server can then respond to portmap.io, which then will forward the responses onto the end system. Now, you can imagine why this is attractive for the adversary. The victim never knows the true identity of the C2 server. All they have is a domain that points to Portmap. And then from a defense and protection perspective, portmap.io is potentially used by a lot of companies. It's an official business utility that's used by a lot of enterprises. So it becomes more difficult to do things like blanket block portmap.io. Additionally, you're not going to have things like blacklisting across the board be happening for portmap.io, right? It is a legitimate business tool. So you're going to have to piecemeal through specific C2 domains instead of blacklisting the entire domain, again, allowing adversaries to take advantage, allowing communication to bypass simplistic types of security controls as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about malvertising and exploit kits. These kind of go hand in hand, and both of them can use various types of network protections along the way. We commonly will see malvertising do things like geofencing, but in kind of a different way. They'll try and figure out what type of payload to deliver to you based on where you are. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with how malvertising works, let me kind of walk you through it quickly. Every time you click a web page, whether it's click a link, hit enter on a URL, whatever, what's happening is you're communicating with a bunch of systems that you don't necessarily realize. Yes, you're communicating with the web page that's serving you the actual content, but behind the scenes, that web page is communicating with a publisher, talking to an ad exchange and advertisers, and actually opening up real-time bidding for every piece of ad space that's available on that web page. And this happens literally in a microsecond. It happens every time you click and every time you hit enter. So as you can imagine, it is a very attractive avenue for actors to take advantage of. What we commonly see is kind of a twofold approach. you have bad actors who actually participate in the bidding and will buy ads at a very low price. So it allows them to push this malicious content. The other thing that we'll see is they'll actually compromise advertisers or ad exchanges directly and add malicious content to all the ads that are being rendered out of that ad exchange or that advertiser specifically. The basic behavior for this, though, is you have a typical ad, but that ad has a little bit extra onto it. What it typically is doing is interacting with something called a TDS, which is a traffic direction service. It basically directs the victim to where they need to go. So that can do things like direct you to an exploit kit, or it could direct you to a benign page. It could direct you to, say, a fake Adobe Flash update or a tech support scam. The ways that you can get malicious content will vary widely depending on where you are, what type of system you're on. So for instance, if you're on your mobile phone and you're viewing a web page, it doesn't make much sense for an adversary to send you to an exploit kit because you can't be compromised on your phone by an exploit kit. But what you can do is be susceptible to a fake Flash update, a tech support scam, or some sort of Android malware, say, if you're on an Android platform. This is how this type of network protection can operate. Now, on the back end, we have seen exploit kits use things like Tor on the back end and do other types of geofencing to help protect the type of information that's exposed. These are the types of things that we commonly see. So let's kind of tie it all together, and I'll hand it back to Edmund.
Thank you. So yeah, we wanted to kind of walk through a case study, and we wanted to focus on a threat that takes advantage of a lot of the different techniques that we see across the board. In a lot of cases, you'll see malware implement a subset of these, but with Asteroth, it's also referred to as Guildma, we saw them implement pretty much, it seemed like, every mechanism under the sun that they could to try to ensure that they were only analyzing in the specific environments they were interested in. And so this is what the overall infection process kind of looks like. Asteroth is a banking Trojan that was heavily targeting Brazilian financial institutions. So they were interested in victims located in Brazil. So the initial distribution mechanism used by Asteroth is email-based. So they would send an email. The email had a link. If the victim clicks on the link, they're redirected to a web server that the attacker has planted an invisible iframe on. The iframe functions as a soft redirect over to the actual attacker distribution infrastructure, which is responsible for delivering a zip archive. Inside of the zip archive is a Windows shortcut file. If the victim opens that shortcut file, they initiate the infection process, which is a multi-stage infection that involves some JScript, LOL bin usage, the retrieval of additional payloads. But one of the most interesting aspects of this infection was the myriad of anti-analysis and evasion techniques that the malware author had used to try to make sure they were only being executed in environments they were interested in. And I'll kind of walk through what those look like. So I mentioned this was an email-based threat, and here are a couple examples of some of the lure emails that we saw that were attempting to entice potential victims to infect themselves with Asteroth. You can see they put a lot of effort into making the emails appear legitimate. The one on the right was purporting to be associated with a localized rental car organization. You can see they actually had taken the graphical elements from the official website of the organization, and they were using those to try to lend credibility to the email itself. And you can see the link there to the malicious content to kick off the infection process. So if you click that link, you're taken to a web page, and the web page only contains an iframe that is responsible for redirecting the client system to the actual distribution infrastructure. One thing of interest is the relative positioning of this iframe. It was configured to load off screen. So it was invisible to the victim, but once that redirection had occurred, the victim is delivered a zip archive, and inside of that zip archive is an LNK file, a malicious LNK file. So the LNK file is responsible for writing a malicious JScript file on the system and then executing it to kick off the actual retrieval of malicious content and thus the infection process. So you can see the call to get object to retrieve and execute a script located on an attacker-controlled server there. So that stage 2 JScript that's delivered is heavily obfuscated with multiple layers of obfuscation, but once you get through the deobfuscation of the JScript loader, you can see it's responsible for retrieving additional malicious content. So you can see the comments there are actually ones that I added while I was analyzing this and deobfuscating it. But what it's responsible for doing is breaking up stage 3 into 3 different chunks and using a pseudo randomization function to randomize the URL structure that will be used to retrieve stage 3. Those are then combined to create 3 separate URIs, which the malware will then go out and attempt to retrieve malicious executables from. In this case, they had actually split the stage 3 payload into 3 binary blobs. So you can see the 3 HTTP requests that would be responsible for retrieving the binary blobs, which once it was back on the victim system, they would be combined to create the stage 3 DLL, which has been injected and executed. So that stage 3 DLL is what actually implements a lot of the anti-analysis and evasion that we've been talking about. And you can see there's a laundry list of different checks that are performed to determine if the malware should continue to run. And if those all pass, that only then will the malware actually execute the malicious capabilities. So this is what the code execution flow looks like for the anti-analysis stuff. You can see it's like a minefield, right? All of those anti-analysis checks and sandbox checks are performed, and if any of the checks fail, indicating that the malware is being executed in a virtual environment, rather than simply terminating execution, the malware will actually reboot the system forcibly, which is kind of interesting. We don't see that a lot. Most of the time, if malware is implementing anti-analysis and one of the checks fails, the malware will just terminate execution. In this case, it would forcibly reboot the system. So let's kind of walk through some of the checks that the malware performed. One of the first things that it would do is it would check for the presence of guest additions. Those utilities that you can install inside of a VM within VMware or VirtualBox that make the user experience more seamless, that enable things like copy-paste and shared folders and things of that nature. When you install those guest additions, they leave a ton of artifacts within the VM, within the registry, as well as via the presence of different executables and processes that may be running. So the malware would check for that to determine if it was being executed in a VM. They would also profile the hardware subsystem of the infected machine to determine if they could identify any hardware devices that would be indicative of the various hypervisors that are commonly used, QEMU, VirtualBox, VMware, things of that nature. One of the interesting checks that they did was they actually looked at the system BIOS date to determine if it matched June 23rd, 1999, which upon researching actually appears to be the default system BIOS date stamp associated with VirtualBox. In addition to this one, they also checked for the existence of running processes in the VM that may indicate that analysis tools were being run. And you can see the list of all of the different utilities that they were specifically interested in. In addition to things like debuggers and disassemblers, they were also looking for a lot of the dynamic analysis tools that malware analysts run in virtual environments in their malware analysis labs as they're attempting to analyze malware. So if any of these processes were detected, the malware would reboot the system. Likewise, they would try to get a handle on various DLLs, which, if they exist on the system, indicate that they're running in the sandbox environment. An additional check was for the product ID. They had a couple of static values that they were checking for, and if the product ID of the system that the malware was executing in matched these values, it was indicative that they were being executed in a sandbox and execution would terminate. They were also looking at the user account that the malware was running in to match them against a list of username values that would also indicate they were being analyzed in a sandbox environment. They were checking for the presence of hardware devices associated with soft ice as well to try to determine if analysis tools or an analysis environment were present. They also used the isDebugger_present trick that's really, really common across various malware out there. They were also using the PEB, the process environment block, to determine if there was a debugger presence And in addition to that, they were loading NTDLL, and they were checking for the presence of functions that are associated with wine that would indicate that the malware is being run in a wine emulated environment. There was another set of DLLs that were also checked for that would indicate that they were running in a sandbox, and they would also look for executables that were associated with the QEMU hypervisor as well to determine if the VM was in a QEMU environment. And then finally, they were checking the language settings of the system. So they had a substring, Portu, P-O-R-T-U, and they were checking the language set of the system the malware was executing on, and they would only continue execution if the language set of the system was Portuguese or a Portuguese variation present within Windows. So assuming all of those checks pass and the malware is confident that it's not being analyzed and that it's not being executed in a virtual environment, the malware would go out and retrieve a stage 4 payload. And the stage 4 payload would then be injected into the user init process using process hollowing. And so you can kind of see the functions associated with the stage 4 payload. There was a lot of demonology reference throughout the infection process, throughout the campaigns. And one of the things that they had done was their versioning of the malware was based on the names of various demons. Just during the analysis process, we identified that the malware had been revisioned several times. So this is a constantly evolving threat that's got continuous development taking place. And one of the things that stage 4 would do is it would check for the existence of the latest version of Asteroth, and if it wasn't on the system, it would go out and retrieve that latest version. Just during the period of time we were analyzing samples, we saw that version increment several times. So in the case that that stage 4 kicks off and the system's been infected, the malware would actually go out and retrieve additional modules. And the module payloads that were retrieved would actually be stored using alternate data streams on the system, just another mechanism to make detection more difficult. So stage 4 ran through the entire list of anti-analysis checks that I previously described. In addition, they also checked for the system host name. So common sandboxes that are pretty heavily used across the information security industry typically feature VMs that have specific host names. So they had a list of host names, and they would check the host name of the system that stage 4 was executing on to attempt to determine if they were being executed on in a sandbox environment. You can see Tequila Boom Boom, which is a pretty commonly known VM host name out there. So one of the real interesting ways that command and control was initiated was through the use of YouTube channels. So what they would do is the malware would attempt to retrieve the C2 domains to use to establish a command and control channel with the attacker by going out to YouTube and retrieving those C2 domains. And you can see that they had a list of YouTube channel URLs that would be accessed to try to retrieve the list of domains the malware should use to initiate command and control communications. So the way this worked was the YouTube channels that the adversary had created that were publicly available on the internet, they used channel descriptions to contain an encrypted and encoded list of C2 domains. You can see an example of one of these descriptions here where within the 3 pipe delimiters, the list of C2 domains has been encrypted and then obfuscated with base64 encoding. And so we wrote a utility to deobfuscate that process, and you can see what that looks like here. You take the YouTube channel that you're interested in, and then you use the blob that's present within the YouTube channel description, and it'll perform that decryption and decoding and spit you out a list of the actual C2 domains that the malware will attempt to initiate communications with. In the case that the YouTube channels had been taken down or weren't available, there was actually a failback C2 mechanism whereby a hard-coded URL present within the malware could also be used to obtain a list of C2 messages, or a list of C2 domains to use. And this is what the actual C2 beacon format looked like once a command and control channel had been established. You can see a lot of the normal information about the infected system that we see pretty commonly with command and control during things like bot registration and things of that nature. So this provided a case study in evasion techniques. This malware was very, very evasive, and the adversary behind it took a lot of steps to ensure that they were only executing within victim systems that they were interested in. In this case, it was the customers of Brazilian financial institutions. So from a defense and detection standpoint, there are a lot of ways that you can detect this sort of activity. And this isn't just specific to Asteroth or malware evasion, but these are all best practices that can be used in a variety of different scenarios to actively detect and be able to respond to different intrusions. Part of defending against these sort of threats is establishing a comprehensive defense in-depth security architecture that's multi-layered, with each security control working in parallel to provide the most comprehensive protection possible. And so with that, I will leave you with, one of the things we do at Talos is we try to make as much information available as possible. And so here's some resources if you want to stay up to date on some of the latest research that we're doing. This is available to, anyone that's interested in malware, that's interested in the latest threats that we're seeing across the threat landscape. So I highly recommend checking it out. And with that, I'll open it up for any Q&A. Thanks, everyone.